Good morning, everyone. Honorable guests, distinguished delegates, fellow officials of this conference. We are now in the closing ceremony of Role Model 2015. This is a story which started a long time ago. Actually, this is the 6th edition of the Role Model UN. Everything started in 2010 with a bunch of 100 students, and now you can see how many you are in only 3 committees. So you can see the improvements of these years and how everything developed and got better. I am this Undersecretary General for this edition. I just started as a delegate at the very first edition of the Role Model UN. So it's an honor for me to welcome to this closing ceremony and introduce you to our honorable guests. We are going to have, just to give you a roadmap of what you will listen right now, we will have 3 interventions of Mrs. Patricia Colbert and Claire Bishop-Sambrook. We will talk about gender equality and how to implement gender equality in order to get better and have better outcomes in terms of Millennium Development Goals. And then we'll also have a speech from Mr. Alessandro Politi from the NATO Defense Center, and he will deal with the topic of the Security Council. After this, your honorable chairs and director will offer you a speech, and there will be the award ceremony. So I will now give the floor to Mrs. Patricia Colbert that will deal with empowerment of women in order to get better the Millennium Development Goals outcomes.
Stand up because I like to stand. Good morning, everybody. My name is Patricia Colbert, and I've had the privilege to work on gender issues in food security and nutritional security for the last 18 years. I'm not trying to say I'm an expert. I think we're all here to learn, and I constantly learn new things myself. So I'm thinking after your 5-day odyssey, you would probably, I was trying to think over the last few days, how can I make this meaningful and give you that elevator speech so that you can leave here with something concrete to think about in terms of why it's important to do gender mainstreaming. And one of the things that struck me as I was reading through your excellent work here on the resolution is that it captures a lot of the issues that are global issues that are of extreme importance. But it's a bit light on the people. And why am I saying that? I'm saying that because food security and nutrition security and issues around climate change are not about machines, they're about people. And people are not the same. We have a tendency, because of the huge sphere in which we work, to try to make people into homogenous groups. We would hate if somebody came into this room and said, I'm looking at all of you, and I can see you're all human beings, and you all need a pink sweatshirt. Would you feel happy? Maybe not. I don't think you would, because they're not seeing you as an individual who has specific needs, and that those needs are linked to the role that you have in your community, the role that you have in this world, your responsibilities, and how those responsibilities translate according to whether you're male or female, the age that you are, very often the ethnicity that you belong to, in many instances the religious group that you belong to, your sexual orientation. All of these issues actually affect the way the world sees you. And we know it because we're all guilty of the same sin. We look at people, we look at the color of their skin, we look at whether they're male, whether they're female, whether they're young, whether they're old, and we make value judgments about their importance and significance, their levels of power within the situations where we are either interacting with them socially or in other instances. Why am I saying all of this? I think when I started out my career and working on gender mainstreaming and looking at issues around women's empowerment, it was very, very sort of based around translating these very formalized documents that are supposed to be there in place to help us to do our job better, okay? The reality is, I wish somebody had just shown me these 3 cartoons, but this is me. This appeals to me, so I apologize if you think it's a little infantile. But I just want to show you something here. Okay, how does one... Sorry, I'm not right-handed, so I got to turn around here and use my... See, my other disadvantage in life, being left-handed. Can somebody actually see? I can't see from this angle. Can you see, Claire? Yeah. No, it's that Join phone. No. Sorry, this is... yeah.
Here. From the beginning, isn't it?
Yeah, from the beginning. Okay. So I just wanted to look at this. It's a bit simplistic, but I think it actually is the kernel of the message here today. Because I can see that you've spent a lot of time looking at all of the international instruments that can help us to get better understanding. But I've come from WFP, and we see ourselves as the action agency, you know, the World Food Programme. We go to places where no other agencies actually manage to deliver food, and we do it successfully. The reason being that 70% of our response mechanisms are related to crisis, be they political, climate crisis that occur, and our first duty is to provide food to all of those who are adversely affected by the crisis that is actually occurring in their country. So have a look at that. How many people are standing behind the fence? It's not a test. Can I hear you? Okay, well, I'm hearing 1, I'm hearing we don't know, I'm hearing 7 billion. Okay, let's say for the sake of argument that it's 1. But actually, when we look behind the fence, we see that there are at least 3 people that are representative of the kind of situations that we have to respond to. Now, as you can see, these 3 people are very different. You have one pretty tall person who we can see from over the fence, and then you got these other 2. The last one, very animated, kind of, let's say that's a child. Okay? Now, in the greater scheme of things, the person that you saw in the first cartoon is the person that we normally see. So we say, when we go out and we take our MDGs and we start talking about food security, yeah? We usually say, oh, we meet everybody's needs. But unfortunately, because of the sex, let's just say the second person is a woman, and let's just say the third one is a child, and that child is a female child, just for the sake of argument. Their visibility is conditioned by the way we view the world, and by the way the world organizes itself to respond to their needs. Okay? So this is why gender analysis and looking at gender equality being equal opportunities, equal access to services, be they global services, be they national services, okay? If we only see that person, that's the person whose needs we're going to understand. We're not going to try and understand the other needs. I want to go back for a minute to the instruments that we have at our disposal. Within the UN system, and I see that you have made a lot of references to the MDGs. I was asked to sort of address a little bit the issues around that are emerging now, because this, for me, is one of the most exciting years in my career. 2015. We are now moving from the MDGs to the SDGs. Okay, and the idea being that we learned from our implementation of the MDGs to try and enrich and inform the formulation of these sustainable development goals, yeah, which will come into play as of next year, because this is the end of the MDG era, or so it's supposed to be. But it doesn't mean that you throw the baby out with the bathwater. A lot of what we learned from there also has informed the formulation of some of the new SDGs. What does that mean in the long term? It means that we're hopefully getting a lot of the lessons. But you know what it's like when you're doing these huge, big international sort of agreements and trying to encompass all of those issues, because as human beings, we're complicated. Life is complicated. The world is complicated. Everybody wants to be top dog. Everybody wants to have power. Everybody wants their particular area of expertise to be center stage when it comes to looking at the SDGs. But one of the things that we, the gender practitioners in the world, the people who try to make sure that we look at diversity, we don't limit ourselves to thinking one size fits all, because it doesn't. We know that. We're looking at the SDGs as an opportunity to better address issues of food security. Now, one thing I'm assuming that there's room for you also to go back and revise and review this resolution. And one of the things I would encourage all of you to look at is look at the Secretary General's declaration last year and subsequent translation of that into action of what we call the Zero Hunger Challenge. How many people know what the Zero Hunger Challenge is? Yeah? I don't see it mentioned here. It is actually one of the instruments that the UN is using to help it steer a course, because we all need a roadmap. We all need to understand where we're going. We all need to really have instruments out there that help us to address the basic issues. And to help us then, something like this resolution should not be something that we wave in the air and say, we have a resolution here. We need action. We need an action plan based on what's happening here. It needs to include, I think, if I may be so bold, very substantive references to the Zero Hunger Challenge. Within the UN system, we have many, many, many instruments that we try to use to provide cohesion. Why do we need to work together? We all have very different mandates within the UN, but I now put my arm around my sister agency here. We have a lot of work that we do together with IFAD. Claire here is from IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development. We do a lot of work with FAO as well, not just in the gender arena, but in many other arenas, because we all have agreed and have accepted that we have to work on what we call gender mainstreaming, both within our institutions, but also beyond our institutions, so that we can translate what it means to address men and women's needs, children's needs, acknowledging the fact that people are not the same, but that we can use that to help us better deliver what it is we're supposed to do. And what is it we're supposed to deliver? We're supposed to deliver tailored services that meet the requirements of the people that are in need. And also recognize that because of power relations, because the way the universe is, and because the way societies are, you cannot make assumptions. If you are going to go on to a career on working with people-centered approaches, I would urge you, do not work on assumptions. Do not work on the assumption that women are always the most vulnerable. Gender is about people. It's about men and women, and it's about understanding how all of these very lofty agreements, resolutions, policies, how they all can come together and help us to really, really understand who are we seeing, who is invisible. And there are, for me, I'm just trying to be a little bit paring it down here and being a little bit reductionist. For me, there are two universal factors of visibility or invisibility. And they are what sex you are, what your sexual orientation is, and also what age you are. We have difficulty sometimes reaching the old. We have great difficulty, including in the statistics that we gather. We have huge difficulty in acknowledging that children are not a homogenous group, that children have sex as well. And we talk a lot about nutrition, food security and nutrition there's a lot more attention being paid to the factor of the first 1,000 days, the importance of the first 1,000 days in terms of maternal nutrition and children's nutrition, not just in terms of actually providing food security for children for the first 1,000 days, but also to improve their mental acuity, their ability to learn, their ability to be educated. All of these things are interlinked. There's one more slide here, and this talks about equity. Because, you know, equality is one thing. Equality is saying that everybody has the same opportunities. Now, we can say to ourselves that everybody has the same opportunities. But if there are underlying gender inequalities that are in a given context, and I'm not saying we're here to make judgment calls about anybody's societies or about anybody's communities. We all respect the laws, the unwritten laws mostly, of our communities and of our families. Everybody does that, be they here in Rome, be they in Azerbaijan, wherever they are. Everybody has to live by the rules, the unwritten rules, and very often silent rules. But all of us know exactly what they are. And how people manage those roles and those responsibilities is something that we have a duty, if we talk about food security, that we need to address systematically. Okay? And how we do that is, as you see now what's happening here? There are different mechanisms being put in place so that those who were previously invisible are made visible. And this is equity. This is gender equity, where we say, okay, these people, we didn't see them at first. We're not saying that, for example, in our work in WFP, when a crisis hits, we often have to deal with massive numbers of either internally displaced people or refugees. Now, our policy to date has always been to do what we call blanket feeding for everybody involved. But once that initial stage of a response is over, it is our duty to understand, have we actually seen everybody? In the last couple of years, an awful lot of attention has been paid, particularly within the humanitarian context, on looking at issues to do with accountability to affected populations. I don't know if you've heard of this. It's an approach that says we have to date, and this is, I think, a measure of some of what I see as the gaps in this resolution here. There isn't enough emphasis on the people. The people are everything. They are and we can't work on assumptions. We need to really understand what's happening in their lives, what makes them even more vulnerable sometimes. You know, there's been a lot of work done in development to try to close the gender gap. I'm not going to talk to you about all of those issues now. I see there have been a lot of references to FAO. I would urge you, if you're interested in this subject area, to go and look at the state of, the SOFA reports. It's an annual report from FAO that comes out on the state of food and agriculture, and the 2010-2011 version of that SOFA looked at closing the gender gap in agriculture. But it's not just about agricultural production. We have to look beyond that. We have to look beyond development and understand and acknowledge the fact that very often when there are crises, which is 70% of our work in WFP, when we have to respond to a crisis, there's a very big danger that those advances that we've made in development are lost when it comes to responding to a crisis, because we're all human. We all fall back on our safety net, and very often what we find we're dealing with in WFP, especially in terms of gender, is that sometimes by trying to change the role of women in their society, we actually could sometimes run the risk of putting them at greater danger. So we need to be mindful of all of these issues. What I wanted to say is, to help us do all of this, as I said, I mentioned the Zero Hunger Challenge. This is one of the things that helps us translate what we need to do in terms of making sure that people have access, proper access to food, appropriate food, that people have proper nutrition, that we're looking at, we're not excluding anybody from the picture, we're trying to be as inclusive as possible, because one size doesn't fit all, and crises hit people differently, as in terms of development as well. We can't just talk about a lump and mass of humanity. Humanity is very different. As I said before, We all love to think of ourselves as being very windswept and interesting and having dashing ideas and wanting to change the world. Everybody would like to be able to have a hand in that, but everybody would like to also have dignity. Everybody would also like to be in a position where they had choices, and that's where empowerment comes in. We can't empower other human beings, but what we can do is make sure that they have access to the services, training and education that allows them to make those transformations in their lives. I just want to link a little bit to what Claire is going to talk about, and that is the whole thing about transformation, urban and rural transformation. And we're moving now in post-2015. We're still in 2015, but it's, post-apocalypse, post-2015. We're heading in the right direction, and this is a really seminal year. There's also another number of things that are happening this year that will help us to really, hopefully, move forward in a more concerted way, and that is to think about the fact that in WFP, for example, we do a lot of what we call school feeding programs to try to make sure that we redress the imbalances in girls' access to education. Now, in many instances, we've had a lot of success with that. In fact, so much success that in a number of countries, what we now refer to as the middle-income countries, we're handing over those programs to be run by the government. And that means that there's a better, not just not registration at school, but actually physical attendance at school by girls and boys. But research is now suggesting, as we start to gather doing our monitoring and evaluation of some of the projects that we're doing, that there's a gap growing in many countries between girls' and boys' education. So for us, we want to start looking at that in a slightly different way and sort of make sure that, including one group of people doesn't exclude the other. Because as we all know, there are many instances in the world where if we talk about transfer of power or we talk about empowerment, it's not a zero-sum game. What do I mean by that? If I say that I want to empower a group of people, it means I'm taking power from somebody else. If there isn't a dialogue between those two groups about the imbalance in power, then nothing really substantial or sustainable is actually going to happen. I wanted to also talk a little bit, just for a few seconds, beyond 2015. At the moment, we're going through a very, very comprehensive process in the UN system. For the last 3 years, over 55 UN agencies have committed to reporting on an annual basis on their gender mainstreaming and women's empowerment activities, and that is achieved through our work on what we call the UN SWAP. The UN SWAP is the UN system-wide action plan for gender mainstreaming and women's empowerment. It's extremely long. But the agency that's guiding this process is UN Women as well. And one of the things that all agencies have said that they will do is to have a comprehensive gender policy in place. So that's what we're working on at the moment in WFP. So what are we seeing is the future? We're seeing that, a lesson is only learned when it informs how you proceed in the future. So we're looking to the post-2015 SDGs as being something that builds on successes, but also builds on the challenges of the past. And I'm afraid that from the gender perspective, as usual, like all social programs, because everybody feels, it's touchy-feely, it's not really sort of solid, major sort of technical work. I see as well here, sorry, if I may, just another advertisement I'd like to make on the resolution. In paragraph 7, where you talk about asking engineers, ecologists and biotechnical experts to participate in exchange programs, that always makes me kind of feel, where are the villagers? Where are the men and women who farm the land every day, who are the ones who know better than we do how to manage that land, how to manage their agricultural production? Where are the people from the urban settings? Because we keep on talking about it, but it's so removed, it's way out there. More and more urban populations, migration from the rural areas, What is it teaching us? How is it informing the way that we, as the international community, respond to people's needs? It's the same thing when there is an emergency. I'm going to talk a little bit more about emergencies, and then I will shut up because I know my time is up. But what I want to just say about emergencies is we have to increasingly, it's a very, very, we're in a world that is full of crises, political crisis, climatic crisis. There is less and less money available to respond to the needs of the food insecure, the nutritionally insecure. So we got to tighten our belts, but we also got to be more cohesive in how we respond. And part of that response as well is making sure that in all instances, be it in development or in humanitarian response, that we're linking the two areas. That we're saying, you know, when we make a response to an emergency, that we're not just saying, okay, this is an emergency, so anything goes. We just respond willy-nilly. We try to link up to what has been done before in terms of development to make sure that there's a continuum and that there isn't a disconnect between what's done for development and what's done for humanitarian response. And on that issue as well, in 2005-06, there was a massive, massive, massive effort on the part of the UN system to initiate reform. This reform also included the NGO community and also the IFRC, you know, the International Federation of the Red Cross. They're seen as the three pillar groups who support emergency response. Part of that regrouping was to ensure that we had better people-centred approaches, both from a food security perspective as well as managing refugees, looking at hygiene issues in terms of humanitarian response. So there's a whole wealth of experience that's out there. I would also encourage you, if you can, to think about this world in crisis, and you know, because there's an assumption in some of the way this document has been put together that, you know, we're working in a world that's even, we're working with people who all have the same reaction. So we need to think about that a little bit more. So my plea to you as you leave here after the 5 days is, please don't forget the people, please don't forget the women, please don't forget the men, don't forget the little girls, boys, the teenagers, women and girls who are exposed to appalling things in times of crisis. There are men and boys as well who are exposed to appalling things in terms of crisis. And we know that that is not a silent 800 million people out there who are hungry or who are suffering from malnutrition. They are people that need to be seen, but their invisibility and their lack of, shall we say, voice is very often linked to the fact that within their own communities, they're told, you keep quiet. In the world, we don't see them because we don't reckon on them. So my urging would be to just sort of go back to this resolution, take a look at it and see how you could be a little bit more, if this was me. I don't know if you've heard of the veil of ignorance. I can't remember the name of the guy now, but there's a guy I think in MIT, who has this theory of justice, which is based around a world where there are, yeah? John Rawls, thanks, yeah. Who says that if we had to create a world where everybody had justice, you would have to have people come into a room and not understand what role they themselves would play, okay? So imagine tomorrow you're on the receiving end, and I wish it never happens to any of you, but say you're on the receiving end and you end up with nothing, and nobody listens to you, you don't factor into anything. What would you like to be in place that would make sure that you were valued, given the dignity that you deserve as a human being, and that justice was something that you could look forward to? This is all I have to say for the moment. I'm going to pass over now. That didn't talk. Oh, by the way, sorry, I didn't mention enough about women and women's empowerment. When we find this situation here, we talk about equity. Very often, the point is, as I said, we don't make assumptions. If we go in with ideas that, oh, this is Goma in the Democratic Republic of Congo, I know that things are like this. You don't know. The great thing about humanity is it is very, very, very dynamic. Human relations are dynamic. We do not work on assumptions. When we go in and we do our homework properly, which is what this is all about, when you go in and you do your homework properly, you sometimes find surprises. Because you're not going in with your sort of, I see the world the way it is, and I understand these people behave like this group behaves like that. Never worked like that. You cannot do that. Everybody deserves a chance to be heard. Everybody deserves to have their perspective of how the world works for them, because it's very different. And I could regale you with stories from here to eternity about the way people are treated differently because of their sex and because of their age. But anyway, in terms of equity, what we very often find when we go in and do our initial little needs assessment, we find that we still come up with a majority of women. Shock horror, especially in agricultural response and especially in crisis as well. We find that there are more women than men who are disadvantaged. So in order to address that, we do what we call in UN speak, women's empowerment. It doesn't mean that we say, now go forth, you are empowered to take over the world. That's not what it's about. It's about saying what do we need to do? What measures do we need to take in terms of giving women access to agricultural inputs, access to microcredit, access to education, access to training, so that they and their families can come out of the poverty trap and out of the food insecurity trap. And this is what we use to talk about empowerment. But I'm going to hand over now to Claire, because I think it's important that we link also to what IFAD is doing in this arena. I'll be willing to take any of your questions once this is over. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Okay, good morning. So my name's Claire Bishop and I work in IFAD, which is the International Fund for Agricultural Development. And it's a very nice continuum because we have the World Food Programme that works on emergencies and then moves into that first stages of development. And then IFAD is basically it's the only UN agency which is also a bank. And so really we're a little bit like the World Bank, but we just concentrate on agriculture and rural investments. So what I'd like to talk about is, I also enjoyed reading your resolution, and my talk is really linked up to your points about, number 1, about the urban and rural linkages, and number 5, about sustainable livelihoods. And it touches on some of the other areas about livestock, about climate change, about crop production systems. But I would also, a bit like Trish was saying, I would really also like to strengthen the gender dimension and the people perspective. And as you actually can see from our IFAD logo down in the bottom corner, we actually, as our tagline, we have investing in rural people. So although our projects are all about irrigation, value chain development, rural finance, linking to markets, working with producer organisations, all the time at the centre of our work is the people perspective. And so I would echo the same comments as Trish, that actually reading through this, interestingly, you picked up a lot on Indigenous peoples. You talked about Indigenous peoples' seed systems, local knowledge systems, which is absolutely appropriate. You talked a little bit about women, particularly in terms of being mothers, in terms of feeding and things. Given the average age of your group here, there was not one word of the youth. And for us in IFAD, whilst we also talk about Indigenous peoples, about gender, the new hot topic on the agenda is the youth, because 40% of the world's population are amongst the youth. And this is a huge area of work. It has a huge implications on what we're doing. So I'm particularly going to focus on the importance not just of gender mainstreaming, but going beyond that step of mainstreaming into these transformative approaches, which I'll talk about. Now, we're a bank, and so our work in IFAD is to work with governments to design loans. A loan is typically 20 million, 30 million, but it could be up to 100 million if there's co-financing. They last for about 5 years, And at the moment, we're working in 100 countries with 260 ongoing projects. Once a country signs to accept the loan, then the implementation is done within the government system or within implementing partners. So during the implementation process, our role in IFAD is particularly to provide implementation support and technical guidance. But it's, the money's been borrowed, and so our job is to help make sure that it has its best impacts. So I'm going to look at three areas. First of all, linking up to your point number one, I'm going to look at rural and urban linkages and how that sets the scene, particularly for this post-2015 agenda that Trish was talking about. Then I'm going to look at some of these underlying gender issues in agriculture. What are we actually trying to address? And then my third bit to finish then is looking at these gender transformative approaches. So starting looking at these rural and urban dynamics. As we know, we've got kind of this growing urban presence around the world, and this is Nairobi. And we've got a series of flows of services and goods between the two. So we've got a lot of movement of people, of money, of produce going in and out to rural communities. But interestingly, and this is definitely a flow which comes from the rural communities to urban areas, is the way in which the rural areas are the host of the environment. And so here we're talking about natural products like forests, we're talking about mineral resources, we're also talking about water supplies. And as the urban populations get bigger, that's placing huge demands on how rural communities can use those natural resources. I was reading recently in Zimbabwe, because the power system is not working so well, many people now are reverting to cooking with fuel wood. So now they're going out into the peri-urban areas and, contributing to deforestation. And that is no longer now being used in the rural community, but it's getting sucked straight into the urban area, which then has implications for how the rural people make their livelihoods. And then, of course, things are getting stronger in terms of technology advances. And obviously, mobile phones have completely opened up rural areas to access to information, access to money flows, and then also this strengthening infrastructure system. But let's have a look at some figures. So by 2050, 70% of the world's population is going to be living in urban areas. What does that mean? Well, okay, obviously pockets of urban areas are poor, but actually at the moment, 75% of the world's poor still live in rural areas. And even in middle-income countries, which have kind of moved up the kind of economic growth curve, it's the pockets of rural poverty where we're focusing our attention in IFAD. Now let's look at these rural livelihoods then. You may know that last year was the International Year of Family Farming, and this gave a great big push to the role of the smallholder farming sector. So these are like families of 5 or 10 people. It's estimated there's about 50 million smallholder family farmers, and they generate up to 80% of the world's food. So what happens in rural communities is important not only for their own food security, but also how well people eat and live in the urban areas. Now, another interesting point is that by investing in agriculture in low-income countries, it has a much greater impact on economic growth generally than other sector areas in which you can achieve growth. So if we're looking at working in low-income countries or the kind of emerging middle-income countries, it's still very relevant to have a strong focus on developing that agricultural sector. Now, the next slide looks at some of the challenges and opportunities. So as we move into the post-2015 agenda, let's just pick out some of the things that are happening. Now, Trish talked about migration. So we see, over the centuries, there's been this general movement of people from urban areas, from rural areas into urban areas. And as a general profile, although as she's been very careful to point out, we should never make assumptions. But as an economist, I love to make assumptions. As an agricultural economist. So let's look. So mainly, even today, it's still the younger people that are moving into urban areas, and often it's male-led migration. So often it's the man in the family that will go. Now that is moving both the young people from agriculture and rural areas, and it's also moving the men. So in the next slide, when we look at what are the underlying gender issues, that then has profound impacts for the productivity of the agricultural sector, because the people who are left behind tend to be older, and there's a disproportionate amount of women. If we look at the other way, though, we're all very aware of resource exploitation, of investments going into rural areas that do very little to benefit the rural economy. And so I think you mentioned here about the decent work agenda, that, you know, this is where we can get behind the private sector investing in rural areas to make sure that the jobs that they offer are actually giving people a livelihood. But just picking up on two things on the positive side then, complementing the movement of people out of rural areas, there's the complementary flow of money back into rural areas. Now, IFAD has a division or a unit that works on remittances, and this is an extremely important area of work because the amount of money coming out of Europe, out of America, and flowing back into developing countries is much greater than the overseas development assistance. And so what we're trying to do is look at ways in which this can be used productively, both to meet the consumption needs of households in rural areas, but also to meet productive investment. So to start looking at ways in which the remittance flows can contribute to local economic growth. But the other thing that's interesting from an agricultural perspective is, of course, that the urban areas, this growing market, this 70% of the population, need food. So that as the producer of food, these present new opportunities for rural women and men to supply that food, both in terms of the quantity, much more attention nowadays to the quality and the traceability of the producers coming into this system. But these then have implications for who's actually now living in the rural areas. So let's move on to the next slide. And then just before I do this, then of course you've also picked up on this. So these rural-urban linkages and things are sitting within a much bigger picture. So we have the global economy, which can have both positive, enabling factors, but negative things like the price volatility crisis. We can look at climate change, which is obviously clearly a threat in rural areas, which then trickles across to the urban areas. And legislation. Legislation is providing that framework for enabling things to happen, but it also can be one barrier too much for many rural communities to participate. But now let's move on to the next slide. So what are some of the underlying gender issues? If we're looking at agriculture, the agricultural sector, and these are just a kind of selection of photographs, just to kind of tease our minds about what we see. And these are still very typical, even in the in the post-2015. This is what a lot of, and particularly a lot of my work is in sub-Saharan Africa. These are common images, complemented by a very urbanized economy as well. But so we're talking about people getting left behind. So here's the grandmother cultivating the land to feed probably her grandchildren, possibly other relatives, using the hoe. Most of Africa is still cultivated using a hoe. It's incredibly hard work. In Ethiopia, you have a man cultivating the land with oxen. Actually, untypically for Africa, most of the land in Ethiopia is actually cultivated by draft animals. But this has a huge gender implication because culturally, women are not allowed to use draft animals. And so when the man migrates to town, the woman then has to wait for a brother, a male relative, a brother-in-law to come and cultivate her land, which has implications for productivity because she's missing the rains. Okay? We can also look at the different types of assets that men and women own. So women often own much smaller assets, much lower value assets that are closer to the home and the home living, whereas men tend to own the more capital-based assets linked to income generation. If we're looking at land tenure, then you've got the customary land tenure systems, and one of the areas that we've been working a lot on is to try and get women on the land title, so that if they've got security of tenure, so if the husband dies, then they still own that piece of land and they can cultivate it and make decisions about it. Another often divergence is who owns the livestock. What type of livestock do you own? So often women are involved in the smaller livestock that can be kept close to the home, whereas the men are involved in cattle rearing and dairy. But then once you get into milk processing and things, then women can step in. But as Trish said, never make assumptions. So women can be also extremely powerful players. So this is down in Malawi, and this is a Zambian woman who's come across to buy the Irish potatoes and export them. So she's a major exporter in the local potato market, hiring men to do her work. On the other side, in India, self-help groups have been a very powerful mechanism for women to get together in a very small group at the local level to start saving money, to start addressing some of their basic needs. And then those groups then federate up to thousands of people. And they were telling me that, so one of these self-help groups, federations of self-help groups, had invited the local bank to come along and meet the members. And so the bank manager, oh, okay, yes, I'll come along. And was astonished. You know, there were thousands of women waiting to meet him. And of course, that then becomes a market. So they can look at the products that they're offering in the microfinance sector or in the banking sector to meet the needs of that huge growing market. So what type of things do women want to borrow money for? Is it for crop insurance? Is it for school fees? Is it for meeting short-term needs? And they can tailor their products to those markets. But a lot of women's time and girls' time is spent doing daily domestic tasks. So if we're looking at the productivity of the sector, it's not just about owning the assets and having access to markets, but it's also having time to do something. So I'd just like to focus on two more areas here. This is from a World Bank study in 2006 looking at women and men's use of time. It's based in Malawi. And this is in December, which is the busiest time of year. So it's after the rains, it's when they're doing the planting, the land preparation, the moving into weeding. And we can see here on the green bar here, obviously it's the time in which they're spending a lot of time doing agricultural work on their own land. And they're also doing a little bit of casual labouring in the red up here when they go and work on somebody else's farm in return for food or cash. But what is the big difference? Why is the women's tower sticking up over there? And it's all these things. It's doing the household tasks of cooking, cleaning. It's collecting the water. It's collecting the firewood. So this is taking up 21 hours a week or 3 hours a day, basically just to service the household. You could call it a non-productive use of time. It's very good in terms of the household being fed and watered and things, but it's not changing the way in which that household isn't going to advance. So this, for me, is one of the areas in which we really need to look. If we're looking at women's empowerment, in increasing their opportunities, we need to look at ways in which we can get women out of this time trap. So that if we want them to do other things, if they're the people left in rural communities and they're still having to go and collect the water, still having to collect the firewood, then things are not going to change. And of course, these tasks are becoming more onerous as the impact of climate change takes place. So if we have more irregular rainfall patterns, if we're having more deforestation, they're having to go further to collect the wood or to collect the water. The other area I just wanted to focus on in terms of gender inequalities, and this complements again one of Trish's comments, is about food and nutrition security. So if we look at, this is like a map that was drawn in Malawi, and this is the household in the middle, and we were focusing particularly on the food coming into the household, so the access to food, and looking at who's bringing it into the household. So here we've got the maize, the cassava, the fish, which the men are bringing into the household, the leaves, the green leaves, the relish, the women are harvesting, the meat, the man is bringing in, the beans, the women are bringing in. So there's a variety of ways in which food arrives in the household, whether they've grown it themselves, whether they've caught it themselves, or whether they've bought it. And the different people play different roles in that process. But what becomes more interesting is, okay, all the food is now sitting in the household. How does it get distributed amongst different household members? And cultural norms, food eating in a household is riddled with cultural norms and traditions. And so here we have what the woman gets, what the man gets, what the children get, what the baby gets, and what the elderly get. And we can see, obviously this is just little schemes, but here we can see, like if we look at the man's plate, he's getting more of the main basic staple. He's getting a nice big fat fish, he's getting the cassava, he's getting a bit of banana, he's getting some beans. The woman, the tiny little fish, much less of the maize meal. She also has greens, which is interesting because the man doesn't like men don't traditionally eat vegetables, whereas she's eating the vegetables, as are the children. The elderly hardly get anything. And then the babies are getting some food supplements. But this actually then has a huge impact on the productivity of the household, and particularly if we're looking at the woman, we've already seen she's doing an extra 21 hours a week, but often she'll be pregnant or she'll be lactating. Her nutritional needs will be much higher, but culture dictates that actually, this example is from Malawi, but it also holds true in many other parts of the world. Nutritionally, she'll be getting much less food exactly at the times when she needs it. There are cultural taboos around people eating, women eating eggs when they're pregnant, eating meat, eating fish. And from a nutritionist point of view, they'll be saying, but hang on a second, that's exactly when you need it. But that's when culture takes it away from them. So this is why I say we need to move beyond gender mainstreaming into these gender transformative approaches. And so this is the last couple of slides. So as Tricia said, many agencies, both in the public sector and the UN agencies, but also the private sector, have now become very good at gender mainstreaming. But we tend to do it through groups, often for reasons of economy. So we will go to the producer group, so we'll go to a common interest group, so the women keeping goats, or we'll go to the small credit and savings group. And we'll look for opportunities in which we can empower the women in those groups. So what can we do? Give them access to the veterinary services, give them access to credit to borrow. Let's get them going. Let's get them engaged in economic activities. We will also encourage them. We'll train them as members of groups. We'll train them as leaders of the groups to go and represent their views further up that ladder so that they can talk to local government, so that they can talk to the bigger players. But the problem is, this is at the group level. And actually, at the end of the day, we all live in our households. And often you can go to the field and you can see a very successful goat keeping group. And you say, oh, this is great. And the women, oh, yeah, no, it's really good. We're really empowered. We're breeding the goats. We're selling the goats. We're getting the money. And, well, what do you do with the money? Well, actually, I have to leave the money in the goat group because I can't take it home because then I lose control of it. So then you say, well, actually, are you very empowered if you have to kind of hide this money away? So what we need to look at is what's happening within the household. And so, because at the end of the day, all these cultural norms and practices, as we've seen from the nutrition picture, play out at the household level. So we can see it will determine what resources women have access to, what benefits they can have access to. So if they earn money outside the home, do they control that money when they bring it back into the home? If not, are they really empowered? Do they have a voice in decision making? Can they say how many children do they want to have? Can they say about looking at workloads? And this has not only implications on the roles and relations between men and women, but it also plays out at the intergenerational level. So on the next generation, they tend to mirror what's happening amongst the adults. So what we need to do, and as I said before, this has implications for the motivation, the productivity, and the well-being of the whole of the agricultural sector and the rural economy. So what do we need to do? So these are the gender transformative approaches, and these are the hot off the shelf ideas. And so these ideas have been developed partly with IFAD support, with Oxfam Novib from the Netherlands, but they're also being picked up by the private sector. So in fact, tomorrow I'm going to a workshop in London, which is being hosted by Nestle Chocolate, who are really looking at how they can engage with women in the cocoa value chain over in West Africa, because they see that they need to do something more than what they're doing already. So don't just think it's the UN that's kind of doing all this stuff. It's actually the private sector. And really, at the end of the day, it's kind of linking up with the private sector where we can have the biggest impact. But what I really like about this is and let's look at the picture here, and this is something which we can do as individuals. And often if you've been on a management training program, one of the first questions they say is, well, where do you want to be in 5 years' time? You know, what do you want to be doing? So you start off with your vision. But now this is at the household level. So you have mechanisms by which households can start sitting and planning together. Where do they want to be in 5 years' time? And it's all based around visual pictures. So you draw a little picture. You know, you want a nice house, you want the children at school, you want, you know, a few more livestock and things. Very realistic objectives. You then say, you come back and say, well, where are we now? Why don't we have what we've got? What have we got at the moment? And then the most interesting bit is saying, well, why are we stuck here? So why don't we have our dream? And in understanding why people are where they are at the present, this is actually where a lot of identification at the household level is of gender issues. They realise that by having these gender inequalities, it actually holds back the growth of the whole household. So the man realises that actually the woman can't work any harder because she's too busy collecting the water, collecting the fuelwood, feeding the family, looking after the children. So if he wants to do something that engages her, he needs to do something to help redress that workload balance. The woman thinks, well, actually, I want to have much more say about how the household money is being spent. So they need to create space for each other in which they can then grow together. And so then what happens is you identify opportunities that are around to move forward, and you identify and recognise the challenges. And so this has become a hugely powerful mechanism. But not only do you have to do it at the household level, but you also need to engage in this behaviour change at the community level. Because if you want people to do things that are different, so for example, if you want men to start being more involved with childcare, you know, if you're the only man in the village holding the baby, you're going to feel pretty exposed. But if a number of you are changing the way in which you do things, then change behaviour. So it's very important that the work at the household level is complemented by engaging with behaviour change and mindset change at the community level. And as Trish was saying as well, that it's also about engaging with men. It's not like I'm going to win and you're going to lose. It's like, let's both win together. We get much further by working together than actually sticking within our traditional gender norms. And so now looking at the last slide then, these are some of the very typical benefits that people mention as a result of having participated in these household methodologies. There's much more equality and respect within the home. There's much more trust between the adults, but then also, the large children would also participate in the visioning. As a consequence of that, the household becomes more productive, the food and nutrition security goes up, the livelihoods improve, you get new opportunities. You can start planning together for a future, which is very important in terms of issues of resilience and sustainability. If you're kind of fighting with your partner all the time, you're not going to be thinking about planting trees and doing things which have these longer term investments. But once you've got a common agreement about where you'd like to be together, then you start investing in conservation agriculture, in climate resilience type measures. A very important factor which has to be recognised is that within many domestic settings, there's a lot of gender-based violence. And this is, in some parts of the world, it's a really crucial issue. And we can see it even amongst these very empowered women who are empowered outside in the public space. They're going home and they're still subject to domestic violence, either physical or verbal abuse within the home. This is something which changes as a result of these household methodologies. And perhaps for many people, that's the most exciting benefit, both amongst the men who often were perpetuating the violence, but also amongst their wives. The harmony in the home is the thing that they all talk about. And this general overall well-being, they have a much better sense of who they are and where they'd like to go to. And the reason why I really like this methodology is that the change is coming from within. So it's not outside agencies saying, we've got to look for gender equality, we've got to promote women's empowerment. This kind of mindset change comes from within the home, and then it can ripple out and then contribute to this sustainable approaches to rural transformation. So thank you very much.
Mrs. Colbert and Mrs. Bishop, thank you very much for your inspiring speeches. Now we'll have a very brief question and answer time because we're running out of time. We are very late. So we will accept 3 questions to both Mrs. Colbert and Mrs. Bishop. So are there any questions? Yes, Angad, please. Okay. Peter.
First question is on humanitarian aid. Sorry, I think we might need to avail of this, otherwise just get back there.
I'll talk with them so they can take my
The first question is, I'll keep it very brief. Humanitarian aid. So when we're talking about the sustainability development goals that are about to come from the post-2015, humanitarian aid, what is being looked at in the sense of sustainability of humanitarian aid in not creating dependency in the areas that you do give relief? Because this is one of the biggest problems. When you go give relief, after 6 months or a year, dependency is high and it's left in a worsened state. Secondly, in the resolution, if you saw the regional committees, what could you comment on the regional committees? Because that was linked to the tailor-made solutions that you stressed upon. And last but not least, on IFAD, I just wanted to ask, what is IFAD's? We had a solution of creating a campaign to, not just in the rural areas, but in the urban areas, to get families, just normal families, to get 10% of their own property to grow food, in the sense that this will actually reduce the burden on the rural areas. And linking now this point to, if the burden from the urban areas population, which are growing, is hindering the rural areas, shouldn't we find a solution in the urban areas as well to increase resources that will then have a less burden in the rural areas? Thank you.
So another question, as we're running out of time. In the back, the girl there.
Hello. About your mentioning of how cultural norms deprive women of nutrition when they need it most, like when they're lactating or when they're pregnant. I was going to ask if your strategies have a dimension on changing those norms and how that's going. Thank you.
So one last question. Daniel, please.
Firstly, we want to say in the name of the Security Council and all of the Roma Immune committees, thank you very much for coming in for speaking. My question is to the first speaker. You gave a long speech about fences. If you can give the top countries where there is a lack of people, like examples where there's a lack of seeing people behind fences, and the top forms of offense that happens in these places, which results in the need for the change you spoke about. Full stop.
Okay, we will allow the very last question now. Angad.
Right. Thank you so much for finally recognizing me, Honorable Under Secretary General. Right. Thank you so much. My first question, it'll be a twofold question, ma'am. You talked about equity for visibility and understanding people's perceptions and their needs. Now, understanding that we have large populations in many countries, such as India, where I hail from. Now, how do we approach that idea, or how is the strategy followed to understand needs of every person over there? Right. Ma'am, my question also goes to both of you regarding the role that non-governmental organizations can play within these frameworks to promote gender equality, as well as provision of food security everywhere around the globe.
Thanks very much, everyone. I'll go to the first question raised on humanitarian aid. Let's be very clear about this. When there is a crisis, it's not like the UN can say, da-da-da-da, here we are, like magic, superwomen or supermen jumping out and coming in to respond. We have to wait for the government, because the first port of call for any humanitarian intervention lies with the government. Request for a response from the UN system, from the NGO community, or from the International Federation of the Red Cross has to come directly from a government. So the first port of call is there. I understand what you're saying about the creating dependencies around humanitarian response, and these are negotiations that have to be undertaken with governments. There's a tendency, again, this is what I see as one of the weaknesses in really neglecting to see that people are what we're talking about. People know exactly what the government can deliver. They know exactly what the UN system will deliver. They know exactly what the NGOs will deliver. And they don't stand by with their arms folded, waiting for, the deus ex machina to come down from heaven and say, I will help you. People already have their own response mechanisms. The dependencies are created when people go in with this kind of stock responses each and every time, saying, okay, you're UNICEF, you come in with the school feeding. You're FAO, you come in with the seeds and fertilizers or whatever it is. The point is that we need to think a little bit outside the box, and this is where I see us going now with the sustainable development goals. Because if we don't take the time to really understand that we're talking more and more about resilience, this year I forgot to mention earlier on when I was talking about the various things, the red letter days of this year. Let's not forget that there was a major conference last week in Sendai in Japan on disaster risk management, disaster risk reduction. And that's one of the kind of resilience models that is coming into place that says there has to be more and more inclusion of people. I see in your document as well here, and I apologise, you raised an issue about another document that we haven't been privy to. But in this resolution, you talk about feedback mechanisms. Feedback mechanisms, you know, there's a whole slew of activities under humanitarian response where we talk about accountability to affected populations. There are 5 pillars of this accountability to affected populations. If you're interested in the details, please go and look at the humanitarian response website, and you'll see more of the details there. But one of the fundamental principles of accountability to affected populations is this feedback mechanism. But you can only give feedback on what you understand. So one of the things that we're looking to improve in terms of humanitarian response is making sure that we're fully transparent, that people understand you will get the following. If we're giving food assistance, if we're giving blankets, if we're giving shelter, whatever it is, that there is full disclosure with the men, women and children who have been targeted to receive this assistance. How does that translate? It means that basically, people know that over a 3-month period, they will receive household food rations for 3 adults, 4 children, whatever it is, and that those rations will consist of A, B, C, D. To avoid exploitation and abuse of these people as well, they are told categorically that these are theirs as part of their human rights, and that they are not to be exchanged for any goods. Nobody can ask them for anything in exchange for this assistance. I'm just talking now from my own experience on the food security side of things. The same applies to any services provided in an emergency. The essential thing about it is that people can only make complaints and they can only give you feedback when they understand what it is that they're supposed to get. So I'm not saying, I don't think that anywhere in this world you have somebody in a dark room somewhere saying, I will design a response that will be a disaster. Everybody's trying to do their best. There are complications. Human life is complicated. Responses are complicated. But I think we're working towards a better understanding of how we can work in tandem with governments to respond. Now, of course, when we talk about working with governments, there's also the dilemma that we very often face in terms of humanitarian responses. Who do we work with? Is there a government? Think about Syria. I'll leave it on that. There was something also raised about, I think this gentleman mentioned over here, the guy on the phone, equity or visibility, etc. I didn't quite get your point about fences and stuff like that, but basically all I'm saying is that globally we have a tendency to see and to respond to the needs of those who are the most powerful in communities, be they male or female. Our understanding needs to be extraordinarily sophisticated. We can't go down, we are not bean counters, we cannot go down and individually work with every single affected man, woman, child of different ethnicities, of different religious persuasions, etc. But we have to ensure that we are raising awareness about the fact that there are different needs out there. Also, we need to understand those things because people are exposed, particularly in humanitarian response, they are exposed to different protection issues. Men are more likely to die during conflicts than women are, but women are more likely to be subjected to rape, abuse, girls the same, a lot of trafficking, human trafficking. We know that there are lots of predatory people out in the world. We've seen examples of that, even in the most recent Haiyan typhoon in the Philippines. We know that a lot of people swept in to those areas to try to take advantage of the chaos to remove children from their communities and their homes. But there are, it's just acknowledging the fact that these things impact differently on people. We can have broad understandings. We have to sometimes use the broad sweep of the brush because we are not in the business of going down and, sort of sitting with everybody holding their hand and saying, now tell us what your needs are. Yeah? That's not our business. Our business is to make sure that we are aware of the fact that when a disaster strikes, it has a differentiated impact on different people within the group who are affected. And it is our duty to ensure that they are part of the discussion around the response, what needs to be done, how long it needs to be done for, and that can lead to some kind of sustainability. But that's kind of the ideal world. We're not quite there yet, and that's what we're hoping, that the SDGs and other instruments that are out there will help us to refine our thinking. It's not that we all need to respond in the same way, we just need to refine the way that we dialogue with government. Claire mentioned the fact that it's really important to include the private sector. Yes, they have a sphere of influence that's absolutely extraordinary, and they want to play a more active role in humanitarian response and also in development responses. But I also think we must never, ever forget the role of government, but most of all, the role of people. Men and women who are poor, who are unheard, who are invisible, who could be jumping up and down in front of our faces. I don't know if you've ever seen that. If you have a chance, go on YouTube. There's a fantastic, it's supposed to be a mind kind of like thing to say that if you are concentrating, or you have a particular, shall we say, technical background in something, you don't see other things. And there's a moment when this video says to you, count the number of times that this basketball is passed from one individual to the other. And in the meantime, dancing across the screen comes an ape. 99.9% of people who see that video do not see the ape. For me, that's gender. People do not see the ape because they're too busy responding to the things that they feel comfortable with. We all have our comfort zones. The idea is that it's not something, there's no magic bullet. There's no one size fits all. There's no one solution. We have to bring everything together and everybody together to make sure that it works. And I think, I know the question on cultural norms is aimed at Claire, but I just wanted to say that cultural norms, it's a bit like anything. They have their place. It's not our place as the UN to come in and say, these norms are appalling. There is no society in this world. I challenge you to find a society that's 100% perfect or 100% awful. There are really good reasons why women are told in certain countries not to consume eggs around the time that they are pregnant. It's because they have no medical services. So if they give birth to a big baby, the likelihood is they will die in childbirth, and their child may also risk death. So if you don't try to understand the nuances of how people manage their societies, and how there are many, many things that we also, we talk about everything. Even I always get very uncomfortable when I hear us talking about gender-based violence or domestic violence as if it were an issue that's a development issue. It's an issue that's global, and it's a power issue. It's not about anything other than power. And if we don't understand power, if we don't factor an analysis of power, who holds power, and nobody wants to, if I'm sitting comfortably on this chair and I see you're sitting on the ground there, am I going to stand up and say, here, I see you're very uncomfortable sitting on the floor there, come take my chair? There's very little likelihood of that, unless I'm persuaded that it will make things easier for me as well.
Right. Well, I'll just pick up on a couple of points. We didn't see the resolution about the peri-urban agricultural sector, but that sounds like a great idea. Growing more, using more of the urban-based resources for feeding local populations is really great. But we didn't see that paper. With the cultural norms, I'm not going to say too much more. Except that one way in which you can kind of, and it's as Tricia's saying, it's not saying cultural norms are wrong or right, but it's opening up discussions around them and their implications. And so one way of looking at those cultural norms around nutrition is to actually involve men in nutrition education. So often we just invite women to nutrition education lessons. So that's where the message gets to them, and that's where the message gets stuck. If the men are participating in the nutrition education, then they have a different idea about the benefits of feeding and food allocation within the household. So there are different ways in which you can deliver messages to members of the household. Somebody asked about the role of NGOs. well, certainly within our household methodologies, they're crucially important because those are often, in these civil society organisations, are the people in rural communities on the ground doing a lot of this kind of networking and supporting very basic and very local development initiatives. And that's where the change starts. When people within the same group as you start doing something differently, then you think, oh, I could do that as well. When it's somebody coming in from outside, from the Ministry of Agriculture, well, actually, they're so different that, they're interesting to watch, but they're not me. So the trick with some of these behaviour change things is that change starts from within, by people from within that context and social setting, because it makes sense for everybody. It's not one versus the other. Okay, no, we need to stop.